Starmer's Chagos catastrophe, the £1.2 million bill dumped on British taxpayers. If you care about where your council tax is actually going and how Westminster's decisions are bleeding local communities dry, then make sure you're subscribed to UK Connors, because we're cutting through the Westminster waffle to bring you the stories that matter to your pocket and your community. Right, let's get straight into this absolute shambles. Picture this. Families landing at Heathrow Airport each week, nowhere to go, no plan in place, and a local London council scrambling to find emergency housing whilst Labour ministers wash their hands of the financial fallout. This isn't some dystopian fiction. This is happening right now in Hillingdon, and the bill is eye-watering. We're talking £1.2 million and counting, all because Sir Keir Starmer's government has orchestrated what can only be described as a policy car crash of spectacular proportions. The Chagos Islands deal, already controversial for effectively gifting away British sovereign territory, has unleashed a migration crisis that nobody in Whitehall bothered to budget for, leaving one council to pick up the pieces whilst ministers presumably sip their subsidised lattes in Westminster. Let me paint you the full picture, because this gets worse the deeper you dig. Hillingdon Council, the borough that houses Heathrow Airport, has been slapped with emergency accommodation costs for 621 Chagosian migrants who've arrived since last summer alone. That's 621 people needing housing, food, financial support, and all the administrative machinery that comes with processing emergency cases. But here's the kicker that should make your blood boil. Another 157 are due to arrive this week. This week, not next month. Not sometime in the distant future when perhaps the government might have sorted out some semblance of plan, but imminently, and the council is watching the cost spiral completely out of control with no end in sight. Now, let's talk about the Chagosians themselves for a moment, because their story is genuinely tragic and they deserve better than being political footballs. These are descendants of islanders who were forcibly expelled by Britain back in the 1960s to make way for an American military airbase on Diego Garcia. Families were torn from their homes, scattered across Mauritius and the Seychelles, their entire way of life obliterated for geopolitical convenience. The injustice of their displacement has hung over British foreign policy for decades like a guilty conscience, and successive governments have grappled with what to do about it. Enter the 2022 Nationality and Borders Act, which granted Chagosians the right to apply for British citizenship. A noble gesture, one might say, finally acknowledging our historical responsibility. Except, and this is where it becomes quintessentially British in the worst possible way, nobody bothered to plan for what happens when people actually take up that offer. Fast forward to Starmer's Chagos deal, which hands sovereignty of the islands over to Mauritius whilst allowing the US to maintain its military base. The deal has been slammed from all sides, criticized for giving away British territory, for the astronomical taxpayer costs involved in the transfer arrangements, and now, spectacularly, for triggering an acceleration in Chagosian migration to the UK that has left local councils absolutely blindsided. David Simons, the Conservative MP whose constituency sits within Hillingdon, didn't mince his words when he said local taxpayers are picking up the tab for government failings. He laid the blame squarely at Starmer's door, calling the Chagos deal disastrous, pointing out that it not only surrenders sovereign territory and commits taxpayer billions, but also leaves Chagosians fleeing to the UK with local councils forced to support them with absolutely no government plan or resourcing in place. Let's break down exactly how catastrophically Westminster has dropped the ball here, because the financial mechanisms at play are infuriating in their inadequacy. Labour ministers have graciously informed councils that they can claim back funding for the first 10 days after Chagosians arrive. 10 days. Have you ever tried sorting out long-term housing, universal credit applications, school places for children, healthcare registration, and all the bureaucratic necessities of establishing a life in Britain in 10 days? Of course you haven't, because it's impossible. The council is reporting that many families need support for weeks or even months until longer-term arrangements kick in. Universal credit doesn't materialize overnight, housing assessments take time, and integration support is an ongoing process, not a 10-day sprint. Yet Westminster's position is essentially, here's a token gesture of funding for just over a week, best of luck with the rest, and by the way, you're on your own. The result is predictable and devastating for local services. The overwhelming majority of the cost falls directly on Hillingdon's housing and social care budgets, which are already stretched thinner than the politicians' promise. This borough, as of May this year, was already accommodating 1 in every 10 asylum seekers in the entire country. Let that sink in. One borough, one council, dealing with 10% of the national asylum caseload, presumably because of its geographical proximity to Heathrow. It's housing policy by postcode lottery, and Hillingdon has drawn the shortest possible straw. But wait, There's more, because this Chagos debacle isn't even the full extent of Hillingdon's migrant accommodation nightmare. The council is already grappling with a pre-existing £5 million asylum shortfall in its budget. £5 million. To put that in perspective, that's the equivalent of Hillingdon's entire annual spending on libraries and culture. Every single book, every community program, every cultural initiative, everything that makes a community actually livable, that's what they're hemorrhaging just to keep pace with asylum costs. The Chagos bill is piling on top of this existing crisis like adding lead weights to someone already drowning. Over the next 5 years, officials predict the gap will balloon to £11.3 million if current trajectories continue, creating a fiscal black hole that will inevitably be plugged by local taxpayers or by gutting other essential services. One senior council official, clearly at the end of their tether, stated that it's unacceptable that a national responsibility should be funded by Hillingdon residents. And they are absolutely right. This is a fundamental question about how our democracy functions and who bears responsibility for national policy decisions. When Westminster signs international agreements, when ministers strike deals involving British territory and citizenship rights, when government policy creates migration flows, the fiscal consequences should not be dumped onto individual local authorities who had no say in those decisions and no ability to prepare for the outcomes. This is national policy creating local costs, and the constitutional arrangement that allows this to happen without adequate central funding is frankly scandalous. Let's consider the broader implications here, because Hillingdon's predicament is symptomatic of a much deeper dysfunction in how British governance operates. We have a highly centralized political system where major policy decisions are made in Westminster, often with minimal consultation with local government, yet the implementation and cost burden frequently falls on councils who are simultaneously having their funding squeezed year after year by those same central government decisions. It's a recipe for policy failure, and we're watching it play out in real time. The Chagos deal was negotiated at the highest levels of government, involving the Foreign Office, presumably number 10, international diplomacy with Mauritius and the United States. At no point does it appear anyone stopped to ask a rather obvious question. What happens when Chagosians, now granted British citizenship rights and seeing their homeland transferred to another country, decide to actually come to Britain, and who's going to pay for their reception and integration? This failure of joined-up government would be laughable if it weren't so serious. We're not talking about some minor administrative oversight. We're talking about a multi-million-pound cost burden being imposed on a single council with apparently no contingency planning, no dedicated funding stream, and no coordination between central and local government. It suggests either breathtaking incompetence, willful negligence, or a cynical calculation that councils will simply absorb the costs and the political blame whilst ministers take credit for the diplomatic achievement. None of these options reflect well on how Starmer's government is functioning. The political optics are dreadful for Labour as well. This is a party that came to power promising competent government after years of conservative chaos, pledging to fix broken public services and restore trust in politics. Yet here we have a flagship foreign policy initiative that's leaving councils drowning in unexpected costs, residents seeing their council tax potentially rise or services cut to cover central government policy decisions, and migrants caught in the middle of a bureaucratic nightmare not of their making. It hands the Conservatives ammunition on both immigration and fiscal responsibility, two areas Labour desperately needs to appear strong on. David Simons's intervention is a preview of the political attacks that will intensify as this crisis deepens. What makes this particularly galling is the human element that gets lost in the financial figures. The Chagosians arriving at Heathrow aren't economic migrants gaming the system or illegal entrants evading border controls. They are people exercising a legal right to British citizenship that we granted them, finally acknowledging a historical injustice. They deserve a dignified reception, proper support, and a genuine chance to build lives here. Instead, they are arriving to find a council overwhelmed, underfunded, and increasingly resentful of a cost burden it never asked for. The families needing emergency housing, the children needing school places, the adults seeking employment. They're all caught in the crossfire of Westminster's failure to plan. This is how you turn what should be a story of Britain finally doing right by people it wronged into yet another tale of government incompetence and communities left to struggle. So where does this leave us? Hillingdon Council is essentially being forced to raid other budget lines to cover costs that should be a national responsibility. That means money intended for road repairs, youth services, adult social care, environmental programs, all the things that make local communities function, is being diverted to plug a gap created by Westminster. Residents who paid their council tax expecting certain services will see those services degraded through no fault of their own. Council officials will be forced into impossible decisions about which vital services to cut. And all the while, more Shagoshan families will continue arriving because a fundamental policy hasn't changed and there's still no plan in place. The Starmer government needs to get a grip on this situation urgently. Either provide adequate funding to councils dealing with Shagoshan arrivals, taking full financial responsibility for a policy decision made at a national level, or admit the Chagos deal was negotiated without proper consideration of the domestic consequences, and work with councils to develop a properly resourced integration program. The current approach of offering 10 days of funding and washing their hands of the rest is not governing, it's abdicating responsibility. Local government minister must sit down with affected councils, primarily Hillingdon, but potentially others as the situation develops, and hammer out a sustainable funding arrangement that doesn't leave local taxpayers bearing costs for national policy. This shouldn't be controversial. It's basic competent governance. The Chagos deal may well prove to be one of those seemingly minor policy decisions that snowballs into a major political headache for the government, not because of the international diplomacy involved, but because of the utterly botched domestic implementation. It's a case study in how not to conduct policy making, a masterclass in failing to think through consequences, and yet another example of the growing disconnect between Westminster decision-making and the communities left to deal with the results. This story isn't over, not by a long stretch. As more families arrive weekly, as costs continue mounting, as Hillingdon's budget situation becomes increasingly untenable, the political pressure will intensify. Other councils may soon find themselves in similar positions. The precedent being set here, that Westminster can make policy creating substantial local costs without providing adequate funding, is deeply concerning for local government across the country. If this becomes the accepted model, we're looking at a fundamental breakdown in the relationship between central and local government, with councils increasingly unable to deliver the services residents expect because their budgets are being raided to cover national policy failures. That's a real crisis lurking beneath these figures, and it should concern anyone who cares about how Britain is governed. UK Connors will be staying on this story, tracking how it develops and holding those responsible to account. So make sure you're subscribed because this is only the beginning of what promises to be a long-running